My husband eventually cut ties with his toxic mother and sister after they demanded we give up our dream house for my jobless sister, her lazy husband, and their 6 kids. My relationship with my in-laws was becoming difficult to digest, especially seeing the dynamics between Daniel and his family. While growing up, Daniel was obviously mama's boy, so he would spend most of his time with her since his father was always busy working. As I came to know Daniel closely, I noticed that his mom, Mabel, was very close to him, while his sister Rebecca did not get the same attention. I think Mabel does love both of her children, but whatever difference in how she treats them must have been hell for Rebecca to grow up with. Daniel, the older brother, did his best at being protective and always trying to be there for Rebecca. The problem has only gotten worse as I've noticed how their behavior affects my life. When Daniel and I started dating, he had just graduated from college and was living with his family, including Rebecca. Mabel gave him an entire floor of the house so that he could have privacy and invite me over whenever he wanted. I would sometimes stay overnight with him, but there were a couple of instances when Rebecca would walk right into our room early in the morning, not even knocking, and engage in some rather banal conversations with Daniel. This usually occurred while we still lay in bed and weren't quite dressed yet, something that tended to make me uncomfortable. I know Daniel was staying with his family at the time, but you'd still think that you'd be able to expect a little privacy and for people to knock before they come in. Daniel and Rebecca were literally inseparable at this time, but we didn't really know each other when Daniel and I started dating seriously. I felt Rebecca's behavior was very disrespectful, so of course I mentioned this to Daniel and told him I wasn't going to visit unless he put a lock on his door for privacy. He agreed, but come morning, Rebecca attempted to barge in, and upon finding the door locked, she started yelling, asking why it was locked. She began jiggling the door and pounding on it, demanding that Daniel let her in. When he finally did, she marched inside, demanding he tell her why he had installed the lock. Then, when she saw me, she pointed at me and started yelling at him, saying he had put the lock on there because of me. I was shocked at how rude and disrespectful she could be. She asked Daniel who had put the lock on, and Daniel told her it was his idea. Rebecca didn't seem to buy this and replied that there shouldn't be secrets between siblings. Daniel shot back that there weren't any secrets. He just didn't want her barging in on us sleeping because it was annoying. Things were getting a bit overwhelming for me, since I'm not confrontational at all. After the fight, I excused myself and went to the washroom, but could still hear Rebecca yelling at Daniel, who was trying to calm her. When she left, Daniel came to the washroom to console me. He apologized for her behavior and said he would talk to her once more so that she would apologize to me too. The next weekend, when I came over, Rebecca did apologize, offering the weak excuse that she really needed to talk with Daniel, so she thought it was all right to come in. Daniel firmly told her not to disturb us again, and she meekly agreed. Although this issue seemed to have been resolved, it wasn't the only weird behavior Rebecca displayed toward Daniel. Anytime Daniel and I had some disagreement, even as simple as deciding on a movie, and Rebecca was present, she would start to throw hints at him that he needs to get with someone who likes what he likes, pointing out that we're not compatible. Daniel would look at her in irritation, but she would just smile back at him. Another time, she asked me a lot of intrusive questions about my past, trying to dig into my personal life. From the very start, Daniel and I were open and honest with each other about our pasts. However, under no circumstances did I feel like letting his sister in on these details of mine. No matter how I feel though, Rebecca would ask me very intrusive, uncomfortable questions, like why my ex-boyfriend had broken up with me, as if I wasn't good enough for him. She would also say things like, "My brother's ex-girlfriend was so much prettier than you." This type of thing always happened when Rebecca and I were alone. Initially, I said nothing, but this went on for so long that I began to feel she was trying to play some sort of game in order to put me down. One day, after taking enough, I finally snapped back at her. I responded to her taunt by saying that I liked my ex-boyfriend's family better than Daniel's, because at least his family wasn't nosy and overbearing. Rebecca was taken aback by my response, and that seemed to quiet her down for a while. What I said was pretty much the truth, even though Rebecca did have an odd relationship with my husband. Mabel was just as hard to take as Rebecca had been when I first entered Daniel's life. She wouldn't say a word to me, at least for some time. Then, when she realized that Daniel and I were serious about each other, she appeared to believe I was attempting to steal her son from her. She would purposely not greet me at the dinner table or any family gathering, like I wasn't even there. Daniel would sometimes notice and try to talk to her about it, but nothing ever changed. Mabel once even called me stuck up and spoiled simply because my parents had sent me to private school while she was a public school teacher. I also know she went as far as to try and persuade Daniel from marrying me, stating he would be able to find a better person to be with. Fortunately, Daniel didn't hold her opinion in high regard and proposed to me anyway. When Mabel and Rebecca found out, they both reacted very negatively to the fact that Daniel had proposed. They called and told me it was a big mistake. I needed to break it off and return the ring since Daniel was not listening to them. I thought it was a little strange, but I refused to allow them to make my decisions for me, especially since I was in love with Daniel and wanted to spend my life with him. When they realized they could not change my mind, Mabel begrudgingly told me I should try to be a good wife for Daniel and take good care of him the way she had all these years. I was a little peeved, but tried not to let it get to my heart too much. Rebecca, on the other hand, accused me of being a gold digger, saying her brother deserved somebody more appropriate for his status. Mabel threatened to expose me before the marriage, hoping it would make Daniel not marry me. Immediately after that phone call, I spoke with Daniel about everything that had taken place, and he was shocked by all the rudeness they had displayed toward me. He had a very serious fight with them, but Mabel and Rebecca stood their ground, saying that I was not worth his while. Daniel had told me not to mind them, that he loved me no matter what they were thinking. His words made me feel better, though deep down inside I felt terrible that his own family did not accept me. Daniel and I had already determined that we were going to pay for our own wedding, so when Mabel offered to pay half, we declined it politely. Daniel told her how hard we worked just to save up for this occasion. Instead of being happy for us, Mabel got even more upset and told Daniel how sad she was that he no longer needed her. On the other hand, Daniel's dad seemed very proud of us. Unlike Mabel and Rebecca, he was ever so calm and very supportive. He never had a problem with our relationship. Since Mabel did nothing but complain, we finally compromised by offering that she could arrange the rehearsal dinner if she wanted to be a part of things. She offered to host the rehearsal dinner, and we were appreciative. In the days leading up to the actual wedding, however, things began to take a turn we did not see coming. The first instance was when Rebecca invited herself over for dinner with us because she said she missed hanging out with Daniel. We had just recently moved into our own place since we were engaged, and so we just thought she actually wanted to spend time with her brother. Daniel asked if it was okay with me if he went to have dinner with her. I wasn't excited about that, but I agreed to because I didn't want to be rude to her, since she would become part of the family in a short time. So we're sitting there eating, and out of nowhere, Rebecca just blurts out that she hates cheaters. She said cheaters are nothing but useless pieces of trash. Both of us looked at each other, trying to figure out where she was going with this. Then she locked eyes with me and bluntly asked how it felt to be a useless piece of trash. I furrowed my brows in confusion, not understanding where this was coming from. Suddenly, Rebecca started yelling, accusing me of having an affair with my coworker, Zach. Daniel immediately asked her what she meant by that, and Rebecca began rummaging pictures of me and Zach together, triumphant. She waved the pictures around, insisting she had caught me red-handed. I already knew I had never cheated on Daniel, so I was both intrigued and perplexed at why she thought I was having an affair with Zach. As I looked through the photos, I was utterly confused where this was all stemming from. First, the pictures she showed didn't look alarming. Yeah, Zach and I were close colleagues, but that was because we started working for the company at almost the same time. We would cover each other's mistakes so that the boss wouldn't scold us in the future. Zach even had a girlfriend, which Daniel knew. My phone wasn't even locked, and I was always open with Daniel about my colleagues. Those few moments captured in the photos were quite harmless, but Rebecca twisted them into evidence of an affair that never happened. The truth behind her accusations simply did not exist, and I could not help but feel angrily frustrated at her continued attempts to sabotage my good name and create tension in my relationship with Daniel. Before I could defend myself, Daniel stepped forward, looking quite shocked and upset. He asked Rebecca why she had been following me and taking pictures of me with my colleagues in several public places without anyone's consent. Rebecca, in an attempt to explain herself, said that she just wanted to investigate me because she didn't believe that I was of their status. She claimed that she feared I was marrying Daniel for his money. Daniel told her sharply that it was not true and she was making much out of nothing at all. He tried to reason with her, asked her to stop lying, to stop trying to destroy our relationship. Still, Rebecca would not accept that Daniel needed to see the obvious affair going on. I also tried to get her to see that Zach and I were colleagues, but she wasn't having it. Her accusations hot up the room so much that they became more demanding. Finally, fed up with her behavior, I told Rebecca that I would report her to the police for her illegal actions of photographing and stalking me. Her face turned pale with shock, and she asked me if I was serious. I let her know in no uncertain terms not only did I have proof, but she had gone to great lengths to follow me and take pictures of me with my colleagues in an effort to ruin my name with her lies. Rebecca turned to Daniel, looking at both of us. She then proceeded to beg him that the things she had done were for his protection, and that it had never been a big deal in her eyes. She really begins to plead with Daniel now, asking him to talk to me, that her career and future would be ruined if I went ahead and filed the police report. I made Sil aware that she was the only one who could rectify the situation. She asked me what I wanted from her, and I told her that I would not file charges against her, provided she kept out of my life from that day on. There was nothing more she could do to get out of the mess she had caused. She turned on Daniel, but he stood by me, as he told her she should be thankful I was willing to let it go, considering how wrong she had been. Sil grudgingly agreed to stay away, and since then, we haven't spoken. Daniel still keeps in contact with her, but she hasn't dared come near me since. The second problem was the night before our wedding. At our rehearsal dinner, Mabel had refused any help from us at all in the way of taking care of the event until the said event. She said she had everything under control, but when we arrived, it wasn't what we expected. The rehearsal dinner ended up being served in some type of picnic tables with plastic tablecloths and cold Mexican food for dinner. She continued to act angry, which made the whole vibe weird. Then she started making off-colored remarks to the guests, after she had been drinking, about how she couldn't wait for the wedding to be over and how stressed out she was, even though she hadn't lifted a finger financially or planning-wise. Finally, my fiancé had enough and walked her out. Ella Perne finally took off to the paving and ran along the road so she could see what had happened. She finally tried to defend her mother's behavior, but my father-in-law wouldn't take it. You can guess the rest. The whole thing was a disaster, and I started to worry they would somehow manage to ruin the next day's wedding. That night, Daniel and I had our first argument. I told him straight that he should uninvite both Sil and Mabel, for I was convinced that, with their behavior, they would surely create trouble during the wedding. Daniel was stubborn, trying to convince me that his father would keep things under control, but I still remained uneasy. In a last-minute desperation, I told him that if his mother and sister were not uninvited, there would not be a wedding the following day. Daniel was shocked at my ultimatum. For the first time, I realized how this statement sounded harsh, but honestly, this feeling of anxiety over what could happen just wouldn't go away. I did not want to get embarrassed in front of my family and friends once again. Daniel hadn't set those hard boundaries with his family yet, on our wedding day, and I hope my ultimatum finally made him realize how much his family was affecting our relationship. Luckily, Daniel understood and made the correct choice. Early that morning, he phoned his father to inform him that his mother and sister were no longer invited. Frank wasn't surprised at all, although he promised Daniel he'd ensure Mabel and Sil wouldn't show up uninvited. From that day forward, Mabel and Sil began to call Daniel incessantly. It was clear they were trying to convince him to allow them to come to the wedding. But Daniel stood his ground. He told them that after the way they treated me during our relationship, he didn't feel comfortable having them at the wedding. Mabel, worked up, began to fault me as a bad influence, trying to come between him and his mother, but all the while trying to calm down Sil. But Daniel wouldn't back down. I did feel guilty that Frank couldn't come to our wedding because of his wife and sister. Truthfully, I felt pretty bad about giving Daniel that kind of ultimatum, but all my guilt vanished when I later found out from some of Daniel's cousins that Sil and Mabel had planned to wear white gowns to our wedding. It came out that they had a family WhatsApp group with only the girls in it, wherein Sil had suggested that everybody wear white too because there was no reason why only the bride has to be in white. I was in a total state of shock of how far they wanted to go to hurt me. After finding out, though, I did feel relieved they were uninvited. Daniel did miss his family, but he also understood where I was coming from. Our wedding, all in all, was great, and no one tried to upstage the bride. After that, Mabel and Sil stopped talking to me altogether, which frankly was a relief, and I was totally okay with it. They would just invite Daniel over for dinner or special occasions, which I didn't mind much. But Frank was always nice to me, and we became very good friends over the years. Daniel and I were prudent with spending and eventually were able to buy our very first home. It was the first time ever, so it was very exciting for both of us. We were so happy to finally own something so meaningful. His parents and Sil came for a small housewarming. To avoid the awkwardness, I went to spend the day with my family instead. Now to the main point. Last month, I received a very unexpected call from Mabel. This was quite a surprise since we hadn't talked since the day I married Daniel. She asked nonchalantly how I was and how life was treating me. I really was taken aback, but answered her questions nonetheless. Then she asked how it felt to live in such a large house when it was only me and Daniel. Her words cut deep because Daniel and I had been trying for a while, but I had been having trouble conceiving. Daniel knew this. Though it was a very sad reality to have to face, we had come to terms with the fact that we would probably never have children of our own. When I first found out about our infertility, I told Daniel again and again that if he wanted to divorce me and marry someone else to have children, I would understand. But Daniel always reassured me that he loved me and that being childless was something that we could accept so long as we had each other. Our families knew about this, which is why Mabel made such a veiled comment about it. Then she dropped the bombshell that Sil was pregnant. I was taken aback, especially as this would be her 6th child. I had heard from Daniel that Sil's husband, though jobless, was not interested in using protection, hence these surprise pregnancies. Sil's partner was lazy and never did anything to help out around the house. He treated her as if she were a personal servant, never helping with the kids nor any house chores. Even after many discussions with her, Sil never seemed to leave him. Mabel then went on to say that since Sil wouldn't be able to continue working throughout her pregnancy, she thought it might be a good idea for Daniel and me to give up our house since it was too large for a childless couple like us. I was stunned at her request and I did not know what to say. I asked if she was serious, but Mabel said she was dead serious. She went on to say that Sil and her husband needed a bigger place, but since there wasn't room enough at her own place, she had decided to ask them to move in with us. Her words hung heavy in the air, and I was in a quandary over my own emotions as I tried to frame a reply. I told her this was our home, one we were still paying for, and the idea of someone moving in without even asking us, without our consent, was quite invasive and unreasonable. But Mabel and Sil continued to press the point, Mabel asserting that she had already spoken with Daniel and he had agreed to this arrangement. I thought this was odd, as Daniel and I were always open with each other, and I knew that if he had agreed to this huge thing, he would have told me. I let Mabel know firmly that, this house being owned by both Daniel and me, this decision was definitely not hers alone to make. He could not do it on his own accord without me agreeing to the same. No one could move in without both of us giving our consent, So I told her I was willing to host Sil and her husband for a couple of days, but wouldn't let them move in permanently. But Mabel started to shout at me that it was my obligation as a daughter-in-law to accommodate Sil and her husband. She said further that if I just follow her instruction, all our past misunderstanding will be forgotten. I then replied in anger, "Okay, I can let them stay for a while, but we are still the one paying for this house. I know that if Sil and her husband move in, they won't be paying towards the mortgage or bills, so I think it's only right that you contribute to the costs. We'll be happy if you could just take care of the mortgage and we could take care of all the bills. I know you only have one job, so when do you plan on getting a second one to help pay off the debt?" When Mabel heard this, she was so angry that she yelled and behaved angrily. She said that was silly, and I shot back that it was no more silly than her expecting us to take in Sil's family with no help from her. That really set her off, and she went on, yelling, while I just stood there, feeling good about my retort. She finally hung up after she realized I was not going to cave into her demands. I was soon called by Sil, angry that I had asked her mother to help us with the mortgage payments. She accused me of being a gold digger, to which I told her calmly that the actual gold digger in the family was actually her partner, who did nothing at all in support of her. This shut her up. I told Sil that she could argue with me all she wanted, but I would never allow her family to move into our home unless they were willing to help us with the mortgage. She branded me as heartless and said I valued money over family, but the biggest relief came when I finally stood up for myself. I had regained control of my home, and it felt empowering to not back down. I do feel a little guilty thinking of the ex-husband, and now here I am on Reddit wondering if I've done something wrong. Update: thank you to all that supported me. To answer the most common question, why would my mother-in-law ask something so unreasonable? It's because she's always been unbelievably entitled. Clearly, my husband has let this behavior go on far too long, and now it is time for us to have a serious talk about it. It's frustrating how she can lie about her own son just to manipulate him into getting what she wants. My sister-in-law is nothing but a pawn in her game, doing whatever her mother tells her in hopes of getting the same favor returned to her. That way, my sister-in-law would benefit because she could use us to pay her bills and look after her kids while her husband does nothing. I am just waiting for my husband to come back from a business trip so we can handle this in person. I do not want to get into this over the phone. Update 2. It's been 3 days since my last update. As I said before, I was waiting for my husband to come back so we could finally sit down and have a serious talk. When he came back, I told him everything that had happened with his mother, including how she demanded we give up our house for his sister and her family. To this, Daniel was visibly shocked, and I explained the whole situation. He finally admitted that he did not know anything about this, and all that his mother had told him before his trip was that his sister was pregnant. That was all he knew. He had no idea she would make such absurd demands. I told him firmly that I needed him to speak with his mother about this, as I couldn't handle dealing with her and her family. He agreed to call her and did so right in front of me. He confronted her and asked why she had lied to me about him. Taken aback, Mabel backpedaled, protesting she hadn't lied precisely and that she was certain he wouldn't have a problem with his sister moving in with us. Mabel had obviously taken matters into her hands and confronted me directly. Daniel interrupted her, asking why she thought he wouldn't have a problem with his sister and the rest of her family moving in. Mabel answered that because he and his sister were so close, he would obviously want to help her by letting her family stay with us. I shut my eyes in frustration, but remained silent as he told his mother there was no way in hell that he was allowing his sister, her husband, and their 6 kids to move in, and that she had no right to pressure us into taking them in either. Mabel started to yell, arguing that his sister needed help so badly. Daniel remained calm and told her that it was none of our business. If she wanted to help her that badly, then she could take them in herself. Mabel tried to explain that she did not have room enough at her place, and as there is so much space in our house, we could easily take in his sister and family. She even went as far as to suggest that since we were childless, it would be easier for us to help out. She told me that I should take care of Sil's children also, and said that it would make me feel fulfilled. My eyes grew wide with surprise, and for the first time, I saw my husband change color in his face. He suddenly yelled at her, saying that she did not have any right to use such insensitive words and that she couldn't use those words to manipulate me into taking care of Syl's children. Daniel continued that Frank had every right to keep his distance from Syl since she was only a baby factory and he was finished with both. Mabel tried to be in between, but Daniel was still screaming and saying how he did his best to get along and bear the constant disrespect shown toward me. He also added that he could not take it anymore. Mabel begged him, but Daniel was firm, telling her this was our home, and I was his wife. Any person who disrespected me, disrespected him, and didn't deserve to be in his life. With those last words, Daniel hung up the phone. He hasn't contacted Syl or Mabel since then. Frank did call him, but after hearing the whole situation, he completely understood why Daniel made such a drastic decision. He apologized to me on behalf of his wife, but I told him not to worry, that none of this was his fault. Update 3. The last couple of weeks have been quite interesting. Many of you suggested setting cameras up around the house just in case Mabel and Syl decided to come around and make a scene. I took your advice, ordered cameras online, and put them up around the property. And, as if by fate, they did turn up last weekend. I saw them at the door through the cameras while I was alone at home. I immediately rang Daniel and he told me he was on his way. When I opened the door, guess who stood there? Mabel and Syl, visibly angry. They wanted me to let them inside, but I stood my ground. I told them that if they have anything to talk about, they can talk from outside. Mabel started to yell at me and called me heartless and accused me of being selfish and greedy. I kept my cool and told her firmly that this was our home and they could not just barge in here uninvited. She raved on, not knowing the cameras were catching it all. I told her calmly, referring back to our previous discussion, that under no circumstances was I to give up our home for S and her husband, adding if they had any more to say, it could wait until Daniel came home. S started to scream, saying I was needlessly ruining the family and was super stubborn. She told me that not only was I a gold digger, as she'd always suspected, but now I was trying to take her brother away from them. I then calmly let them know that their entire conversation was being recorded on our security cameras, and then I'd use that footage to file for a restraining order, ensuring they'd stay at least 50 feet away from our house in the future. Their faces fell, and Mabel cried out that I would never do such a thing. I smiled at her and told her if they weren't off the property in that instant, she'd be getting that court order sooner than she thought. This had them pause, and S tried to convince me I was overreacting. Fortunately, just at that moment, Daniel turned up. He approached quietly and asked Mabel what they were doing here. Mabel, in her excitement, ran to hug him, but he backed away, asking again, this time more forcefully, what they were doing at our home. S then began to explain that they knew it was me trying to control his life by stopping him from speaking with them, and that they had come to confront me. I couldn't help but roll my eyes at how ridiculous they both sounded. Daniel told them firmly that the decision to cut contact was entirely his own, and he didn't want anything to do with either of them. Mabel immediately started begging him for forgiveness, but Daniel simply told them to leave our property or he'd have no choice but to call the police. Their faces were in absolute shock, not expecting him to say this. Daniel went on to say if they ever showed up at our house again, both of us would not think twice about calling the police and having them escorted out. They looked crushed, but Daniel was unmoved. I felt a surge of relief that he was finally standing up for me. Finally, they left, still fuming, but we were finally at peace. Since then, Daniel has talked to Frank, who was just as shocked as we were that Mabel and S had gone behind his back to show up at our house uninvited. He agreed that we were right to not let them in, and he too was becoming increasingly fed up with their behavior. I'm confident that with Daniel being so firm, they won't dare return to our home. If they do, I'll have a lawyer send them a formal notice to stay away. I'm just relieved that Daniel is finally seeing how toxic his family can be, and I'm hopeful they won't cause us any more problems. I truly hope this is my last update on this situation, as I'm ready to move forward and leave it all behind.